maybe just to sort of get a feel, which will maybe help us a little bit, are most of the people in the room producers? Is that kind of the perspective that you all have, or do you have different things that you, from a different perspective, that you want to see other than producer? I mean, I think it'll end up being somewhat producer targeted, but if there's some other viewpoint that some of you have, or you're doing something other than producing, is anybody outside of that, or we'll just stay with producer? Okay. Okay. Great. So thank you to the Hollywood Film Academy, to Gia, for setting this up. Hopefully we have some fun, we learn a little bit, and we get to talk a little bit as well. So my part, and obviously Alejandro's here, he's very much an expert in distribution. So my part will focus, we'll do a little bit of really sort of big picture industry things, and then we'll dive down a little bit into financing. And then I'll do it in 2 blocks. We'll take a break in between, and then we'll also have time at the end of each block to take questions and have a little conversation about what we just went over. Okay. So I'm also going to have some repetitive slides in here, because I think they'll just come back and kind of reinforce. So we'll look at something, we'll go away from it for a little bit, we'll come back to it. So if it looks repetitive, it's intentional. This is probably the one that's going to be thematically through the whole presentation, and I apologize, I think the resolution isn't great. It looks much better on my screen. But essentially what we're gonna do throughout is we're gonna try to look at kind of a cross-section or a view of a single picture transaction. And if we look at this sort of circle of participants in the process, think of it as we go along as kind of an amorphous kind of thing. It's a little bit like if you filled a balloon with water. What you'll see is, as we talk about these things, when you push here, there's an impact somewhere else. So we'll just use this as kind of a hub to come back to, and I guess we'll just walk through the simple participants in this picture. So we've got the producer. We sort of center the actual entity that makes the film, and I don't know how much background you guys have, but typically when you're making a film, you try to put the actual film into, a special purpose entity. So when you see this SPE, that's what it's referencing. And so it's kind of a bankruptcy remote legal entity, and I'll come back later and talk about the importance of having a good lawyer in your process as a producer. It's quite critical. So we have the producer, and obviously we have talent, so director, actors. We have capital more or less on this side. So I simply broke this down between equity and debt. A lot of these topics can get very esoteric and very detailed. We're gonna dive down occasionally, but we're gonna try to stay in kind of a summary view, because I think it's easier to get the key concepts that way. A completion guarantor, I don't know if you're familiar with completion bonds. We'll talk a little bit about that. That's something that typically capital is very interested in seeing. It's kind of the basic idea of a completion bond is it's a specialty insurance product. It's giving the capital comfort that essentially the film will be completed on time and on budget. So you pay a premium, they take a risk that if you're going over budget, they have in-house personnel that can come in and sort of monitor the project. So as a producer, you kind of have somebody looking over your shoulder a little bit, but it comforts the capital and it makes access to capital a lot easier. On this side, we have a sales agent, and these blue boxes down here are really looking at the distribution market, which is, as Alejandro will show you, is essential. And in this case, I just spread out numerous international distributors and one domestic distributor, and all of these entities tend to contract with the special purpose entity. And there's a sort of a faint circle around here that you'll see, and when we come back to structural things, you'll understand why that's there. But the actual SPE is generally contracting with a lot of these entities. It could be that the producer and the equity and sometimes the talent actually have a direct ownership interest in here, but the producer is generally going to be controlling this through the production. And then here we have a collection agent. This is sort of a service business. There are a couple of pretty well-known players in this part of the market. They kind of function like a paymaster. So it's almost like an escrow in reverse. So when you're receiving monies from distribution, they come into a common collection account, and what happens is the parties kind of pre-agree to a waterfall, a recoupment waterfall, and the collection agent acts then as a third party that oversees that, kind of as a paymaster. So let's see. So on the outside of this, we put the guilds in relation to talent, and we put production incentives. And even though this is small, this is quite important. Internationally, these structures, and they sometimes get referred to as soft monies. These structures have been around, for decades and used internationally much more frequently. In the last 5 to 10 years in the U.S., they've become a more prevalent thing. So you can find individual states in the U.S. that have active incentive structures, and there are ways that you can monetize those, which help construct the capital profile for the film. So let's move on. So in block one, this is just an outline. We're going to talk about a few larger industry trends. We started to touch on the industry players. We're going to talk about the independent film and the business process. A little bit on distribution. I don't want to steal Alejandro's thunder, but we'll just it's so important that it should be regularly talked about. We'll then get into capital, and we'll start to get into the production finance overview. We'll take questions, we'll break, we'll come back, and we'll kind of dive right back into finance and really go a little deeper in that. So in terms of, these are sort of big trends. So, and some of these are somewhat self-evident, and you guys, I'm sure, are experiencing this like we all are. And they're all obviously very interdependent on each other. And I think, for me at least, I see this sort of digital and technology thing woven through everything, probably more so than anything. But the first, under globalization, so there's been sort of a long trend here of expansion of markets. So internationally, and by the way, is anybody here from the U.S.? No?
No.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Yeah, me. I'm the native. Yeah, that's fine. That's good, actually, because the business is very international. So, in terms of globalization, as an example, you've seen in the past the major studios here in the U.S. controlled or comprised, generally at least 50% of the global box office. And what you've seen, over the past several years, I think if you look at the MPAA, they put out studies of this, now you've seen that really tip toward the international markets. So international markets tend to comprise now more than 2/3, maybe 70%, and it's growing, because you have expansion markets like Brazil, China, and other places that are really building out the theatrical business. So and you see the result of that in terms of how even the major studios behave now, where you see sort of global day-and-date releases for premiering theatrical movies, or sometimes they're premiering outside of the U.S. first, and then the U.S. lagging behind that. Then if you get into individual markets, and Alejandro's going to talk a little bit more about the various distribution windows, but when you think about distribution, you think about theatrical, and then obviously you have home entertainment, television markets. TV has been a real driving force internationally. So you have a combination of things going on. You have sort of new markets opening up. Here in the U.S. even, wasn't that long ago, if you look at my gray hair at least, that there were 3 major networks. And then obviously things have evolved from there. And then similar, trends have happened internationally, where you had expansion within individual territories and somewhat of a maturation. And then as digital's come in, it has tended to undermine a little bit some of those rights, like pay TV. So anyways, heavy emphasis on globalization and content changes in business models that are trying to adapt and try to get ahead of it, or at least stay current with it. So you see a lot less, if you think about the US in particular. Historically, there's been such a, push their sort of cultural export on the world and tell stories the way they think they should be told, and you're seeing, I think, a little bit less of that. There's still a fair amount of that, especially if you're here, but I think you're seeing less of that, so you're seeing more global stories being told, because the reality is if you have a good local story that has mass appeal, it has every chance that an American story should have. And in terms of business models, clearly, from a business standpoint, I mean, I've been doing what I do for 25 years, and by and large, it's always been an international business. But that's never been more the case than it is right now. In terms of consumers, this is a big deal, because if you look at, I have 10-year-old twin daughters, and it's interesting because they're moving into an age now where they don't really watch TV that much. If you look at distribution itself, in the US, historically they've talked about a big part of the marketing campaign in prints and advertising. Prints are essentially gone or nearly gone globally now, and they're delivering movies on hard drives, and that's about to change as well. I think you're going to see a lot more just straight digital distribution by the major studios. There's a consortium to do that via satellite right now, and I think there are other people looking at potentially competitive lines to that are more terrestrial, T1s and things to get product around. So that's having an impact, and it's impacting capital as well. You probably have all heard of a thing called Kickstarter. So if you think about things like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, I think they're still aligned with Distributor. So people are trying to find different combinations of ways to also give independent filmmakers access potentially to capital. It's always easier to say those things than to actually execute them, but at least they're there where just a few years ago they weren't. And a lot of this, what this does as well, in addition to sort of the reach that you can get with your product, the addressability to specific, end audience users, and the cost reduction, you also have just speed. And you'll see that affecting the business models where a lot of the timelines are being compacted because of this. Because if you think about it, if you think about reading history when you were in school, information moved at the speed of a horse at some point. And so now obviously it's a whole different world, and it's a great thing, and I think it's flattened. I think the bottom line is that the world's flatter, more connected, consumer driven, and always changing. So back to the industry players. So I apologize for the resolution on this. And if somebody wants to during the break, they can look at it maybe on screen as well. But I kind of just looked at from content creation through to exploitation and started to break it down into 4 main categories: development, production, distribution, and exploitation. And this is kind of what's called a Venn diagram, where you see just a lot of deliberate overlap, because the reality is there aren't very often these days a clean handoff point from one to the other, where people have different definitions of when they've moved from one of these to the other. But capital tends to, work its way into all of them at some point. So on the development side, obviously from idea to, development of that idea, screenwriting, publishing, rights holders, which will be key when we get to the finance side, who's actually controlling the actual rights. Into production, the producer, for example, is a good place of overlap. Obviously the producer's regularly involved in development, but as it moves into production, you have a lot of those same players, but then obviously you layer on, actual production personnel, crews, keys, special effects, and through to post-production, editors, sound, and eventually you get to distribution. Now again, distribution is going to get involved a lot earlier, hopefully. If you're able to attract distribution, it's better to get them involved earlier, because if you can shape the product in a way that it's going to get to the target market in a better way, then you'd like to start that process earlier. So you've got distributors, both here in the US, internationally. You've got sales agents, which are quite a key component internationally. They tend to be a key link in terms of opening up the world to your product. I'm not sure what everybody's background is, but there's several key film markets coming up each year. One will be next week. Alejandro is leaving Tuesday, I think, for Berlin, which is the European film market. Then the next major one will be Cannes in May. There's the American film market, which is right over here every November. And then there are some other things that have popped up and become markets that are also festivals, like Toronto, Sundance. So there's a variety of ways, and that's without getting into the TV side. There's a whole TV circuit of similar markets, and during those markets, a sales agent will take, one movie. So if this is your movie, they're basically fracturing the rights, and they're taking those rights, and typically they're licensing them internationally to, as many as 40 different territories, even more. Yeah. And then what happens from a financing standpoint, that becomes critical, because what they do is they go out, and to the extent they can attract distributors globally, they take that sort of bundle of license agreements and they come back and they try to get capital with it, either from banks or private investors. And exploitation, obviously, theatrical exploitation, involved in that you have bookers who actually book the individual cinemas. You've got media buyers. This idea of print and advertising still theatrically is such a big component. The lifespan of movies theatrically in the U.S. is very fleeting these days. So if they don't get their audience right away, they're going to lose them right away. And even when they do get them, the drop-off is dramatic. I think it's like 50% typically from the opening weekend to the next week. And the bulk of those revenues are going to happen in the first 3 weeks, probably. And then obviously digital's having a huge impact here. So you're seeing people playing and experimenting basically with these distribution windows as well. So I was just reading something the other day where numerous of the studios were quoting how big their digital purchases of movies were prior to all their home entertainment values, but in some cases prior to their theatrical revenues. So they're experimenting with all kinds of different reordering of those windows, and that's on one hand very disruptive in the marketplace, but probably a very necessary thing, and I think it's gonna be a little bit of experimentation, but people will be building smarter and smarter business models around that. So let's see. This attempts to kind of lay out the production process, and again, in a lot of what I'm doing, I'm making some sort of big picture categorizations and things. The truth of a lot of this is, every individual situation has its own dynamic, so the lines get blurred a lot in this, no pun on my display. But basically, so you can sort of track, from development, and then if you look at these three as production, so you've got pre-production, principal, photography, and post-production, and then into exploitation. And what I did down below here is I tried to lay out some capital timelines. So this gives you a flavor of the varied types of financing, and I again apologize for the print, so I'll read these to you a little bit. This top one is production financing, which typically really comes into play when the movie's ready to go into production, so maybe during pre-production. And the lighter green is sort of the deployment of the capital when you're spending it as investment capital, and the darker green is when you're actually into receipts and hopefully recouping and recovering the capital. There's some development financing here, which is largely done by private equity, and ideally that, even if it overlaps with pre-production, is going to get recouped out of the budget, basically. And here you've got P&A financing on the other end, so as the movie's about to be released, this becomes critical financing, and who provides it and what kind of terms they either require or demand. These are not such big items, but there's bridge financing and finishing financing. In the independent world, it does come up a lot. So imagine you've got your movie, you're negotiating with a bank, say, and it looks like everything's on track, and suddenly you've got 2 or 3 of your international license agreements the documentation for those hasn't really been completed. It's maybe in process, but it's getting delayed. You get in a pinch because you're committing to actors, and you're risking the movie not starting. And if the movie doesn't, in some cases, if the movie doesn't start, you lose an actor, you start to lose your sales or your licenses. So the bridge financing, it's very expensive money, but it sometimes is necessary. I always tell producers, you never want to have to need bridge financing, but when you need it, you really need it, because if you do get it, it probably allows you to prep the movie the right way. And on the other end is finishing funds. So, this happens a lot in very small budgets where maybe there isn't a completion bond, and you've got some element that's come up during the production, and you're over and you're out of money, and you got the movie in the can, maybe you've completed principal photography, but you're still in post and you're stuck. There are finishing funds out there. Sometimes they're put up by post-production houses. Sometimes they're put up by private capital. It's a better place for the capital in a sense, because they have a better idea of what the end product's going to look like. Very likely, you might have at least anywhere from dailies to a more finished cut of the movie for them to look at. So again, when needed, there's sometimes capital available for that. And these kinds of capital in particular, the mantra is they go in last and they come out first. So they're going to recoup their money. So if you had other private equity, that's where it gets challenging, because nobody likes to get shoved aside. But if you want to get to the end goal, that's a lot of times what ensues in terms of the negotiation. So, and this is just sort of just giving you this key as to the timelines.